In this video, I'm going to explain why wrist aiming and the whole idea of a wrist aimer is a scam. I've brushed over this topic in previous videos and actually received a lot of angry comments because of it, so I'm going to go more in depth and explain where I'm coming from. When you aim, you have access to all the joints in your fingers, your wrist, your elbow, and your shoulder. All these joints have different ranges of motion. Your shoulder and elbow have very long ranges of motion, while your fingers and wrist are much tighter in the motions they can make. However, they are also much more precise. So if you're one of these self-declared wrist aimers and someone peeks you from a wide angle and you have to flick to them, or they're running a long distance and you have to track them, you won't be able to do this on a normal sense because your wrist won't have the range of motion to move the mouse sensor far enough. So to play with only your wrist, you just raise your sense, and it'll have to be pretty high. But the fingers and wrist have pretty precise motor abilities, so you can kind of get away with it. Before I can explain why this is problematic, I do have to ask you to subscribe. I'd really appreciate it, and I make a ton of aiming content, so I have a lot of tips for you. You'll always be able to improve and get to really any skill level, but your fingers and wrist will only be so precise at whatever skill level you're at right now. They can make a motion to a small target, but that will either be slow or inconsistent. However, if you lower your sense, you can make more precise motions or have the same level of precision but faster because the targets are bigger relative to your mousepad space. It does not matter how good you are. If your target seems bigger, you'll be able to hit it faster and more precisely. So this comes with the inevitable trade-off of putting yourself back on a sense where your wrist can't make long motions. So what do people do? They commit to the high sense and just decide to perfect their wrist and their fingers to a level where they can make extremely precise motions on them. Now, the other day I was talking to one of these people. He's Voltaic Grandmaster Complete. He's a pretty good aimer. I'm not saying that he committed to his wrist the whole time, but he would play on 19 centimeters per 360, meaning that most of his motions had to come from his wrist. He also happened to be Immortal 2 in Valorant and wanted my advice on making his aim more consistent in these games. I recommend he lower his sense to like 30 centimeters per 360 so that some of his motion gets moved to his arms and his wrist and fingers can suddenly make much more precise motion. He said that it helped him a lot. Now you might notice that 30 centimeters per 360 is still a pretty high sense. It's not that low. This is because if your fingers and wrists range of motion is completely restricted so that they can do almost nothing, then they're also not very useful. So it's best to find a sense that will allow you to balance your ability to move your fingers and wrist, but also have your arm take over for some of the longer angled motions. There's really no perfect ratio of all these motions. It depends what sense you're on that day and how you feel about each joint, and it can really change from day to day. It's just important to not be consciously debating whether you use your arm for a motion or your wrist, because this is a waste of time and will get you killed. I've had people say to me before they hit this certain mental roadblock trying to decide if it's an arm angle or a wrist angle. That's not how it works. Just practice them both in an aim trainer using them together and separately, and then you'll just do it naturally when you're in game. The sense that you're on should be what's forcing you to make wide-angled motions with your arm, not yourself forcing you to not use your wrist. Regardless of what sense you play on, there will come a point where you need arm motion as well. It might be PGTI or Smoothbot, or maybe it's 1-1-4 targets Voltaic, but you shouldn't be limiting yourself to just finger and wrist motion. Ever. The opposite is also completely true. The fingers and wrist are capable of insane precision. If you deny these joints from contributing to your aim, you'll have a much harder time performing as good as you could be. They move extremely precisely, and going on an extremely low sense denies this precision from being able to be incorporated into your aim. Now, you might be thinking, well, how come there's people who are really good at only using their wrist? Like the guy who commented angrily at my last video on this topic. Well, it just so happens that even though that guy was Radiant, a guy got that same rank on an Xbox controller, baiting his teammates with a shotgun. Well, tag FPS games are really just game sense. You don't need to be that good at aiming to go pro or be really good at these games. Also, most of these games involve really small angles for most gunfights, meaning that your wrist isn't that bad and you can get away with like a 30 centimeters per 360 only wrist. It's just moderately restrictive in some scenarios. If you play with just your wrist for 20 years, you can become pretty precise at using it. But again, being very good at this doesn't mean that incorporating some arm motion on a slightly lower sense wouldn't help you a lot. I hope that this video, at least if it doesn't convince people, allows them to understand where I'm coming from. Thanks for watching. If you think I'm wrong, let me know in the comments. I'll be interested to hear it, and I obviously respond to comments. This is literally a video about a comment. Subscribe for more aiming tips.